willingness to be hungry, a willingness to innovate, a willingness to endure complicated negotiations with people you don't understand. It's not for folks who want the easy life. Okay, well, a lot of these folks were going to the New World precisely because in their minds, they would get the easy life. How this all plays out in later decades is a fascinating topic, but we won't get into it. But you can already detect, right, the interest the play has in those people who are forced to work for colonizers, as we talked about last time. Caliban. Caliban's not in there just because he stands in for some, bestial Native American or whatever it might be. Because there's a structural necessity to how colonialism was understood in this period. There's going to be, colonizers who are displaced out of England because there's less opportunity for them there. And what they're going to need are the colonized. In the early stages, these Native Americans refuse to play that role, nor could they be forced to play that role. Which is another sore point for the Yes, theory.
At this point, I don't know the history of the conversation that well. Have they begun to send people over as indentured servants as opposed to sending them to prison?
Comes later. And that's sort of those early efforts to solve the labor problem. And so, actually, yes, for the most, I think it's into the maybe even, and this is as I remember, it's into the even later 17th century that most of the labor consists of indentured servants. And of course, as you know, it eventually gives way to a whole other labor force made up of captured Africans who are being forced into bondage and compulsory labor but at that point, the colony is more established, primarily because it's found a market for itself, tobacco. So tobacco catches on in England, I think, this decade. I mean, actually, I think in another class we were reading. Yeah. Anyway, tobacco is. Oh, that's right. We're reading Harriet. We were reading Harriet in the other class. So Harriet writes in the 1590s, as I remember, and we didn't read Harriet in this class, right? Harriet is a sort of anthropologist, philosopher / linguist who went over to the colony with the very first ships, provided the first Algonquin dictionary, really kind of a learned fellow. But he tries to encourage investors back in England to put money into the colony. In order to do that, he lists an encyclopedic array of possible things that the colony will yield. What's really, really striking about it is almost none of them are. Some of them are recognizable, some of them are not. And then way down the list, there's this little thing about tobacco. Neither he nor anyone else yet anticipates what that will mean in the history of this area. But eventually folks figure it out. So by the time James arrives on the throne, he's already fulminating against people that smoke too much and how bad it is for you, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So the habit catches on very, very quickly. And with the habit comes a market, and with the market comes an even increased demand for labor, which is met first by indentured servants, and later by a slave population. And of course, cotton kicks into the mix too, but that's later. Okay, so here's the fairly predictable problem: was the people who were going over there, desirous of the good life, suddenly find themselves in very, very strange circumstances. And the people we're talking about found themselves not only, far away from home and desperate in many ways, but shipwrecked and maybe, castaways. So what happens then in the Strachey letter is a letter that was sent by one of that party, I believe, as I remember, back home to the investors in London, and it became what had gone on in the Bermudas, and actually things just completely fell apart. And what the governors complained that no one wanted to work, that everyone was adverse to hardship, that the people would not do what they were told, because under the pressure of these new conditions, the social order had collapsed. And one of the Strachey said that there was a mutiny, and one of the colonists to be told the governor, who was trying to tell him what to do, that he could kiss his, etc. And the governor, and so there's a really complex and volatile politics that develops amongst this party of castaways, and the governor responds by having the guy hanging. So anyway, the letter is sent back to London by Strachey to report on this, and it's not published for obvious reasons because, as I said, the adventure, the colonial adventure is in its early stages, needs to attract investment, is in fact not paying off very well, and it seems to involve far more risk than advisable. So the letter is not published, but it's circulated amongst investors, people who are, including the Earl of Southampton, who was one of Shakespeare's very good friends and court contacts. So critics have speculated really since the late 20th century is that The Tempest is A, indebted to Strachey's letter, and B, that this reveals that Shakespeare was in the loop when it came to the community of financial investors who were turning their eyes now westward, tentatively, to the New World. So, Southampton, this is really kind of a corporate twist. In a sense, this play reflects the situation of a certain corporation, big corporation. And Shakespeare has access to its eternal memoranda, and that's reflected in turn in his play. Do you want to say something? Okay, so what's the implication there? Well, one implication is that even though, like last time, we want to see the play's take on colonialism, that's kind of already locked into a set of relations, power relations, top-down relations of domination. As you can tell, the actual situation that the play reflects is still very, very fluid. It's not really clear who's going to come out on top. Whether the guy that says "kiss my ass" is going to be the one that ends up running things, or the governor. Whether the existing hierarchy in England will be reproduced in the New World. Whether the indigents will in fact end up in the Caliban position, or whether they'll just sort of repulse the English invaders and might do so very effectively. In fact, contemporary accounts, contemporary Harriet's treat us show the Algonquin Indians of the area were sophisticated political operators, shrewd enemies, not intimidated by the English. In fact, the English close to extinction, and then everyone knows about the famous disappearing colony, where they were in fact wiped out. So, yeah, sure, colonialism is on the mind of everyone involved. It's on the mind of Shakespeare, it's on the mind of his investor friend, and it's on the mind of the audience. But things haven't yet really sort of gotten to the point where anyone knows how the story will turn out. It's a testament of Shakespeare's extraordinary genius that he can, just given the sort of beginning outlines of the situation in the Americas, from that constructed drama that later becomes one of the signature texts of post-colonial thinking and criticism. Shakespeare's weird godlike prescience it must impress us. But then the historical realities were that Shakespeare didn't really have access to a fixed colonial scheme. Neither did anyone else at the moment. Any questions or comments? Okay, how would that be reflected? How would this situation be reflected in the play? This is one of the number. How would that whole situation that described in Strachey's letter be reflected in the play?
Well, although I guess Prospero comes in and maintains, or attempts to maintain his order as an official, someone high up in the political structure, and by you mentioned structural necessity. A structural necessity, Caliban is the colonized and becomes the source of labor for them. Right. Because the only other option is his daughters, who really isn't expected to do much.
Exactly. So. Right. You mentioned you described Prospero as a high-up government official. It's 1610. So who's on the throne? James. James the First comes to the throne in 1603. Kind of goes to the topics that some of you are already on.